It's Minerva Baker Haddock Day. Because this series is so popular that it has upon occasion broken the internet, I am well aware that we're constantly bringing in new fans. So just a quick recap on Minerva Baker Haddock. She was my great-great-grandmother, and she spent most of her life in Iowa. She gave birth to 10 children, 8 of whom lived to adulthood. She was married to a guy named Robert Haddock, great in the beard department, perhaps a little tough as a husband and a father. He immigrated, I should say, from County Antrim in Ireland when he was about 12, 13 years old. And so at the very least, I'm going to guess he had an accent that spiced up the tough days of farming. So Minerva was my great-great-grandmother. She's also the great-great-great-grandmother of the person who made these rad earrings. Way to go, Yarrow Mead. Anyhow, so she was my great-great-grandmother, and my great-grandmother was one of Minerva's 8 surviving children. Her 7th born child was Daisy Louisa. And we're going to kind of spiral a little bit into Daisy's life. So let me give you an image here for those who are deeply invested in the particulars of my family history. I'm going to give you an image that sums up Daisy's life. Several reports have it that Daisy was the kind of individual who always made any situation more fun, and she made people feel seen, heard, and talked to. So I feel lucky to have had a great-grandmother like that, even though she died the year before I was born, and I never knew her. So if you did actually look at that image that I posted, you will have seen that Daisy gave birth to 5 children. The first girl died shortly after birth. The second was a girl named Mildred. That was my grandma. And the third child was a boy, James Russell Lowell, named after a very famous American poet. James Russell Lowell's fame was perhaps greater 100 years ago than it is now. I think he's faded into not quite obscurity, but he's lesser known. He was known as one of the fireside poets, and perhaps you're going to want to revive the popularity of these poets during these days of self-quarantining, if that's what you're doing. The fireside poets were known because their poems were so excellent for gathering the family around the fireside and reading aloud. So here, please enjoy this James Russell Lowell poem. I don't want to gloss over the fact, too, that after her first kids were born, Daisy had 2 more kids. I kind of got hung up there and forgot. There also was Robert, and then there was Minerva Ruth, who was her youngest child. And I knew them growing up, and they were lovely and very sweet people. But what I want to focus on here today is the fact that Mildred, my grandma, and her brother, they just called him Lowell, her brother Lowell were like a year and a half apart in age, and they grew up, their formative years were spent in South Dakota. So their dad, Fred, was a pastor, and it was the tradition in the church that almost once a year, or pretty much once a year, I think, they would move the pastors to a new what do I want to call it? I want to call it a patronage. That's not right. Words escape me. It's been a big week. And anyhow, so those kids were moving from one small town to one small town in South Dakota virtually every year. If they were lucky, they had a couple years in a place. So you can imagine what that does to siblings in the early 1900s. Those two were tight. As I look at documents that my mom and aunt collected from their mother, Mildred, before her death in 1974, I see how frequently the stories of Lowell come up because, of course, he featured heavily in Mildred's childhood memories. So you can see there's just some notes here, for stories that were going to be fleshed out, and you can just see how much Lowell appears in Mildred's sort of, even her initial notes before she starts telling her life story. One of my favorite stories about Mildred, well, Daisy and Fred took their kids from Iowa when they first were moving to South Dakota. My grandma Mildred was probably about 4 years old when that move happened. And the way they did it is they took what was called at the time an emigrant car, so basically a railroad boxcar, because they couldn't afford to pay for seats in a passenger car of a train. So they basically loaded all their stuff into a railroad boxcar, and it took them, I think, 13 days because they had to stay stopped for at least 3 days at one place before they were allowed to continue on because they were waiting for a pig inspection. So all their worldly goods, including themselves, were loaded into this boxcar, including what they called a sanitary couch, which I think we would just call a couch now. And they would sleep on that, except for the fact that I'm reading in some of these pages here that so they loaded sacks of potatoes into one end of the car, and they put homemade carpets over the sacks of potatoes, and that was Mildred's bed. So Fred and Daisy, with Lowell snuggled in between, would sleep on the sanitary couch. Mildred would sleep on the carpets on the sacks of potatoes. And they had some donations from parishioners in Iowa to help them make their start in South Dakota. So they got a pig and a rooster donated. And then she says here, I'm reading from her recollections, often the switch engine would couple on our car and switch us onto another track. That coupling took such force, it knocked the horses down. So they had horses in there with them, too. They were frightened and got up snorting and stamping, eyes bulging and ears cocked forward. And then the notes here say Mildred, 4.5, and Lowell, almost 3 years old, were on the bed and knocked down and bounced. Great fun! 2 exclamation points. We giggled and rolled around. Mother laid on the bed beside us. Here's another quick Lowell memory that my grandma Mildred recorded. I remember the train men would go past us and talk to us, and the brakemen would go past. The man that sold the popcorn, peanuts, and Cracker Jack, fruit, and whatever on the train would go back to the warehouse and get his basket filled up again. My brother would hold out his hand and say, "More bite, more bite." We thought that was pretty cute. The fellow would hand him, generally, grapes. My brother liked those a great deal. Here's another memory that Grandma Mildred had with her brother, Lowell. We had a good time. I remember that when we had lots of coyotes. I remember going to town in a covered wagon. Dad put in a lot of straw. We never said Dad in those days. We said Papa. He would put a lot of hay in the bottom of the covered wagon and then put blankets over it so we'd have a soft place and have it not quite so stickery. Then the horses got the hay, and it wasn't quite so thick when we came back. Coming home, a lot of times, driving the 15 miles with the team of horses, we thought it was kind of long. Sometimes the stars would be out, but we enjoyed the trip because we could watch the coyotes and our dog Shep. Shep, I think, was really a no-good dog, but to us he was great. Lowell and I thought a lot of him. He was really worthless on the farm. When the coyote would chase that dog, he'd run and get under the wagon. Pretty soon they'd trot along and the coyote would hide behind the sagebrush. Shep would turn around to trot back, and the coyote would chase the dog right back under the covered wagon again. So back and forth they played a kind of tag or hide and seek, and we would just laugh and laugh. We knew we would have these rides home at night and the stars would come out. Mother tried to teach us about the stars and constellations, the Big Dipper, and things like that. Also, when we would go to town in the daytime, my dad would stop the team every once in a while, get out, and kill a rattlesnake. Then we would see the prairie dogs. The owls, prairie dogs, and rattlesnakes would all live in the same hole. They seemed to get along just fine. We thought those little prairie dogs were cute. My little brother Lowell would call them petty dogs. I'm kind of sad that they're becoming quite scarce in South Dakota now. Well, not so much, Mildred. They're doing okay. Okay, hang in there with me on all this stuff, right? What else you got to do? Home entertainment. Right here. Okay. Here's what else my grandma Mildred remembered about their early days in South Dakota in the early 1900s. I can remember another time when Mother was helping put up hay. She was on the stack, kind of fixing it. Dad was boosting me up to her. She would kind of place it around so there would be a smooth top. And Lowell would be below on a blanket. We could see the rattlesnakes quicker there, I guess. He would have pencils, crayons, papers, and things. Pretty soon, we saw her throw that pitchfork way off above our heads down onto the ground, and down she came with a big slide. It excited the folks. Then the family moved to a town called Tripp, which was apparently near Sioux Falls. So they moved there in November. And she says, about Christmas time, my father went to a conference in Sioux Falls, so Mother, Lowell, and I were alone. It must have been after Christmas because it was New Year's Day when this event happened. The night before New Year's, we had gone to bed after our stories and our prayers, and we thought we'd have a good night's sleep. My mother was frightened to death. There was running and yelling and chasing around the whole town and shooting in the air, and the bullets would rattle down on the roof. We wondered, what in the world happened? What kind of riot is this? Are they all wild here? I don't think my mother got much sleep, but we children finally got to sleep and didn't hear all of it. The next morning, Mother inquired around to some of those neighbors. Oh, those German Russians were shooting the devil. But my mother said, it sounded like they were raising the devil. But they did get pretty wild in some places because they did a lot of drinking and they couldn't fire straight up sometimes. They shot through the dentist's window. He had a brand new house and brand new furniture, and they hit the mirror and shattered it all over. They were afraid to get out of bed for fear they'd step on some of that glass. They couldn't reach their lamps. So finally, they fingered around over the floor and picked up the pieces and got to the lamp and turned it on. And they couldn't arrest anybody because they didn't know just which one did it. You want to hear more about those shooting up Russian Germans? Okay. Oh, sorry, German Russians. They shot into other windows and just missed killing a man. He hung his trousers on the bedpost and they shot a hole right through them. Here's another story. One Christmas, my brother and I slept together. The stairs came right up into our room. There was a railing around the stairs so we wouldn't be falling down. We had all our toys up there. My mother made a cupboard, a table, a bed. Grandfather had given me a big rocking chair, and an uncle had given me a little red chair. My brother and I both had chairs, a cradle, and a bed for our dolls. But he didn't have a doll. He always thought he wanted a doll. This particular Christmas, my brother woke up first and was laughing so hard. I woke up, and there, with his arms around the post of the stairs, sat a clown. My mother had made it. She had made it of a white stocking. One of the neighbors across the alley had a dog that ran off with it. In the next few days, it ran off with my doll. But the Dutchman wasn't so sure that had happened, because his dog didn't have any hair on its teeth and didn't have any rags in its teeth. Good evidence. But we had seen that dog running away with it. So that was a lesson to us. Don't leave your toys lying in the yard.